That day, I sat on that park bench like someone who truly believes that 5 minutes don't have the power to break a relationship. I sat with confidence, with the calm innocence of someone who thinks they understand another person's heart. I had no idea those 5 minutes would become the beginning of a revelation that would stay with me for a long time, or that every second sitting there would expose everything I had been trying to ignore. Because the truth is, when someone promises they'll be right back, we cling to that promise as if it were protection. But some promises are born empty, and I would only discover that once the sun began to move as if it were watching me from a distance. The bench where I settled felt more aware of life than I was, solid, cold, quiet, as if it already knew what was about to happen. I rested my hands on my lap, took a deep breath, and believed. I believed because it was easier than facing the obvious. I believed because back then I insisted on giving people the benefit of the doubt, even when the doubt was already screaming inside me. I believed because loving, sometimes, means closing your eyes so you don't see the abandonment walking your way. It wasn't the first time I waited more than I should. It wouldn't be the last time life gave me a lesson I wasn't ready to learn. As I sat there watching the trees sway gently in the breeze, a strange feeling ran through my chest, something between anxiety and hope, a bitter mix only understood by someone who has waited too long for somebody. And maybe you understand it too. Maybe this story has more to do with your life than you realize, because at some point, all of us have sat on a park bench of our own. All of us have trusted someone who didn't deserve that kind of faith. All of us have waited for 5 minutes that turned into hours, days, years, waits that left deep marks, even if no one around us noticed. And before I go on, I want you to tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your city, your state, your country, write it down. Because this story isn't just mine. It belongs to so many people, scattered across so many different places, living similar pains, carrying scars that recognize one another without needing explanation. This experience crosses borders, crosses generations, crosses stories that repeat themselves in different shapes, but always with the same bitter taste of a broken promise. I had no idea that this bench would witness something that would change the way I viewed time, trust, and even myself. I just sat believing nothing extraordinary would happen, sat certain that 5 minutes were too light to carry any emotional tragedy. But sometimes life hides its biggest truths in the smallest details. And as my hands rested on my lap and my eyes followed the slow movement of the park, I had no idea that this would be the last day I'd allow myself to accept so little from someone who claimed to care. And the funny thing is, at first, everything felt normal. The gentle wind, the comforting shade, the distant sound of other people's conversations. A perfect setting for someone who believes they're being remembered, valued, considered. But time has a very particular way of teaching. It doesn't shout, it doesn't pull you by the hand. It simply moves in such a quiet way that when you finally notice, it's not just the minute that's gone, it's your illusion, slowly dissolving right before your eyes. And there, in that first moment, I still didn't know. I still didn't understand that the steady, silent bench beneath me was about to reveal something I had avoided seeing for years. I still didn't know that waiting by itself can reveal who truly stays and who was never really there. But time was only beginning to speak to me. And without noticing, I was about to hear everything. I was still sitting there, on that bench that seemed wiser than I was, when I realized time had begun to move in a strange way. It wasn't just the sun shifting or the breeze getting colder. It was something inside me that began to weigh differently, as if that extra minute carried a meaning I refused to see. For a long time, I tried to justify her absence. I tried convincing myself that something unexpected had happened, that she'd gotten an urgent call, that maybe she ran into someone she knew and got distracted. We always create pretty excuses for people who hurt us slowly, because accepting the truth is more painful than believing a comfortable lie. As I looked around the park, my thoughts rushed through my mind like a flood. I remembered so many conversations I ignored back then, small moments that now screamed inside me, memories of her making plans and showing up much later, laughing as if my presence were optional, of her promising to call but never doing it, of her saying I was important, yet only appearing when she needed something. I always accepted it, always let it slide, hoping one day she'd understand the value of someone who stays. It's strange how the signs were always there, but I refused to see them. I told myself it was just her way, that everyone had their own rhythm, that I needed to be patient. But too much patience also destroys you. With each passing minute, something inside me shifted. The bench felt harder, the air heavier, and my chest carried the weight of every moment I'd waited for someone who never thought twice before putting me second. And maybe you know exactly what that feels like. That kind of waiting that isn't just physical, it's emotional, stretching across years, waiting for attention, waiting for reciprocity, waiting for love, waiting for a simple gesture that proves you're not alone in this world. It's a silent kind of waiting, but devastating, slowly corroding your self-worth and dimming the light you try so hard to keep alive. Time, that day, felt like it was mocking me. I kept looking to the side, to the paths of the park, imagining from which direction she'd appear, and nothing. I looked at my watch, trying to convince my heart that everything was still normal. But the truth? It wasn't. It never was. That delay was just another repetition of an old pattern I hid behind excuses. Her absence in that moment was the reflection of every absence before, those I buried just to avoid conflict, to avoid seeming demanding, to avoid losing someone who, in reality, was never truly mine. As the sun began to lean toward the other side, its light fading gently, I felt a bitter knot twist in my stomach. It wasn't hunger, it was disappointment, that quiet kind of pain that settles in when you realize you placed your heart in the wrong hands. When you realize that the person who promises to return quickly is always the one who's already too far away to care. And still, I remained there, trying to believe she'd show up somehow. Because admitting the truth meant admitting I wasn't a priority, and no one wants to feel disposable. No. One wants to recognize they were forgotten by someone who claimed to care. I kept trying to convince myself it meant nothing, that she would come, that 5 minutes wouldn't turn into loss. But my heart already knew. My heart recognized that feeling. It was the same discomfort I felt when she canceled our plans last minute, when she forgot important dates, when she said she loved me, but her actions always told another story. The body senses before the mind admits it. And that day, sitting on that bench, I began to feel something was out of place, something that wasn't just lateness. It was neglect. It was indifference. It was that kind of abandonment that doesn't arrive with shouting, but with silence. I remember closing my eyes at one point, breathing deeply, trying to hold back the tears rising inside me. Not because I was crying for her, but for myself, for the woman I had been so many times, believing empty promises, accepting crumbs, settling for less. I always thought that if I loved enough, the other person would learn to reciprocate, but not every heart recognizes the value of the love it receives. And I was beginning to understand that, right there in that park. Time moved forward, and with it came the revelation that my waiting was no longer for her. It was for me. I was waiting for the courage to admit that our bond had eroded long before that day. And that's why I want you to write a simple phrase in the comments. I've waited long enough. Write it if, at any point in your life, you felt the weight of an emotional weight that never seemed to end. It's not just about someone being late. It's about the feeling of being pushed aside, being forgotten, realizing your presence never truly mattered to someone you placed at the center of your life. Time kept moving, and I held onto a fragile, almost childlike hope. A hope that didn't match the woman I believed I was. But life has a strange way of revealing truth at the exact moment we need it. And I stood there facing a truth that approached like a slow shadow. Every person who passed in front of me seemed to carry their own story, but none of them knew that, sitting on that bench, I was living the beginning of a silent breaking point. A breaking that wouldn't come with fights or harsh words, but simply with someone choosing not to return. And I still didn't know that that extra minute, that seemingly ordinary delay, would be capable of opening a deep wound I had pretended didn't exist. I stayed there, still on the outside, chaotic on the inside, like someone who senses change approaching but tries to hold it back with trembling hands. And it was in that exact moment of waiting that something inside me began to shift in a way I hadn't fully noticed yet. But something impossible to ignore once time finally revealed its next move. People began passing by as if each one carried a fragment of the truth I was trying not to acknowledge. The sun no longer shone with the same strength as when I first sat down. The golden light began to tilt, creating long shadows stretching across the park. And there I was, watching every movement as if trying to decipher what fate was trying to show me. It's strange how, when we're emotionally vulnerable, everything around us seems to gain meaning. A stranger's walk becomes a metaphor. Someone's laughter becomes a memory. Another person's pain becomes a mirror. The first person who caught my attention was a woman holding the hand of her young son. They walked quickly, almost running, and yet she looked at him with a steady tenderness, the kind that protects even during the rush. And seeing that scene, something inside me hurt. It hurt because it reminded me of how many times I offered that same kind of care to someone who never knew how to appreciate it. It hurt because I realized that for some people, presence is instinct, while for others, presence is effort. I saw in that mother a quiet strength, a devotion I knew well but rarely, received from the woman who left me waiting. That moment made me think of how many relationships survive only because one person carries them, while the other barely notices how much they take. Then my eyes were drawn to a couple arguing quietly, gesturing carefully as if trying to hide the fight from the world. But it was impossible not to notice the tension in their eyes, the desperate attempt to save something that already seemed worn out. I saw myself in that scene more than I'd like to admit. I saw the silent fight for attention, for recognition, for reciprocity. I saw the pain of someone who insists on staying even when the other has already left on the inside. And I realized that in many ways, that couple was a magnified version of what I was living right there, waiting for someone who was no longer emotionally present, trying to keep alive a bond time had already weakened. A little farther ahead, an elderly man walked alone, his steps slow but steady. He carried a small bag and seemed to be deep in conversation with his own thoughts. Something about him touched me deeply. There was dignity in his solitude, a quiet acceptance, as if he had lived through so many goodbyes that now he walked without hurry, without expectation. Watching that man made me reflect on how many times life forces us to walk alone, even when our heart longs for company. And for a moment, I wondered if one day I would walk like that too, not by choice, but by inevitability. Still, I didn't. Let the question form completely, because too many questions at that hour would only make the pain sharper. As time passed, every face seemed placed there to teach me something. A teenager laughing with her friends reminded me of a lightness I once had. A woman sitting on the ground playing with her dog showed me a simple kind of love I'd been missing. A young man running with his headphones on looked like he was running from something I knew well, the weight of his own feelings. Everything in that park felt like it was speaking to me, as if the universe wanted me to understand that while I was trapped in the wait for one person, the rest of the world kept moving forward. And there I was, standing still, insisting on believing in someone who had forgotten me long before turning the corner. The more I observed, the more I realized that abandonment doesn't begin when someone leaves. It begins when you notice you're putting in effort the other person never makes, when you notice you're giving explanations no one asked for, creating justifications for behaviors that don't deserve to be defended. I stood there, surrounded by strangers living their own joys and sorrows, yet it felt like each one carried a message I needed to hear. Messages about presence, absence, care, indifference, messages I avoided because truth, when it arrives for the first time, is frightening. And maybe that's why, in that moment, I wanted to ask anyone listening to write a simple phrase in the comments. I see myself in this, because this story, this feeling of sitting and waiting for someone who won't return, is more common than people admit. It's a shared pain, a kind of emotional wound that crosses borders and repeats itself in so many lives that it barely feels unique anymore. Each person walking past me seemed to carry a piece of the same story. Like abandonment is a shadow that silently follows us all at some point. The sun kept sinking, and the park took on a softer, nearly melancholic tone. The shadows stretched longer, and I felt as though time was trying to embrace me and warn me at the same time. It whispered that life never pauses for anyone, that while I was trapping myself in fragile hope, the world kept moving. It was as if the universe were showing me that life continues, even when someone decides not to return. And that realization began to seep into me slowly, like water slipping through the cracks of an old wall. With every step those strangers took, I felt the weight shifting. I was no longer waiting for her presence. I was waiting for myself, waiting for an understanding that was finally taking shape. Each silent story passing before my eyes expanded my own. Each unfamiliar face reflected back to me what I was experiencing on that bench. And even though I tried not to look directly at that truth, I could feel that whatever transformation that day would bring was becoming inevitable. The entire park seemed to breathe with me, as if every tree, every leaf, every faint sound was preparing me for something I couldn't yet name. And in that silent flow of observations, feelings, and memories, I realized time wasn't just passing. It was trying to teach me something I hadn't been brave enough to admit, something approaching slowly like a wave I knew I couldn't stop. It was there, in that moment when the movement in the square began to fade, that silence settled in a way I didn't know how to describe. The murmuring that once filled the air slowly dissolved, as if the world were turning down the volume just to force my heart to hear what I'd been trying so hard to silence. Late afternoon silence has a weight of its own, an almost invisible force that spreads through the body like a warning. And that day, when the wind grew colder and the light softened, I felt that weight settle slowly on my shoulders. It was as if the universe had decided to strip away any distraction that might spare me from the truth. Hope, that small flame I stubbornly held on to, began to hurt. It was a strange kind of pain, not born from the body, but from a deeper place, where we keep the expectations no one else can see. I stared at the paths in the square, trying to imagine her appearing from somewhere, walking toward me with the same excuse as always. I could almost hear the words she would use, repeated so many times they had lost all meaning. But the more I imagined it, the more distant that possibility felt. My mind, so used to creating sweet stories to justify other people's absences, refused to cooperate this time. It was as if even my thoughts were tired of inventing excuses. That part of the afternoon when the light shifts and everything feels more vulnerable stirred something inside me. I hadn't realized it until then, but fear was slowly approaching. Not a fear of something outside, but a fear from within, the kind that appears when you finally sense you may have placed yourself in an emotional situation you don't know how to escape. And with that fear came a feeling of exposure. I felt seen, not by the people in the square, but by time itself, as if each minute revealed another layer of my own mistake, as if each second shouted that I was sitting there waiting for someone who didn't care enough to return. And with the silence came memory, the memory of other moments when trusting was dangerous. It's incredible how the mind pulls up old memories when current pain begins to press too hard. I remembered promises from childhood that were never kept. People who swore they'd be there and disappeared without explanation. Bonds I treated as sacred, that others treated as disposable. It was as if the bench where I sat had opened a door inside me, allowing all my scars to speak at once. And as I tried to breathe deeply to keep from collapsing, I realized that silence carried more truth than any explanation she could have given if she had come back. Vulnerability took over my body. My hands turned cold, my chest tightened, and a strange sensation of being watched settled in. Not because someone was looking at me, but because I was finally looking at myself without filters, without excuses, without escape. The silence of late afternoon didn't let me lie to myself, and as much as I wanted to believe it was just a delay, a distraction, a momentary lapse, I knew emotional abandonment always arrives in the heart long before it shows itself in actions. It begins like this: a slight discomfort, a brief absence, an innocent-seeming delay. But inside the one who feels it, the impact is devastating. The fear of darkness crept closer, not the darkness of night, but the darkness of truth. I knew that once the sun disappeared completely, it would be even harder to keep holding on to that fragile hope. And that's when my body started to react. My legs grew restless, my breathing quickened, and part of me wanted to get up and leave. to escape that bench before the night revealed something I wasn't ready to face. But another part, the quiet one that understands the depth of wounds, kept me there, as if I needed to experience that waiting to its limit in order to finally understand what time had been trying to teach me. The afternoon went on with a silence that almost hurt, a silence that spoke louder than any explanation she could offer. And as I tried to deal with that growing weight, a feeling of defenselessness spread through me. I felt small, exposed, at the mercy of an abandonment that hadn't even been officially declared. Waiting for someone who doesn't come back does that to you. It strips away your armor, leaves your heart unprotected, vulnerable, as if any wind could knock down whatever strength you have left. I found myself looking around, searching for something, anything, that could distract me, something to interrupt that suffocating stillness, but everything seemed to deepen the sensation. The tree beside me swayed slowly, like a reminder that even nature knows when it's time to let go. The distant sound of people saying goodbye and heading home reminded me that everyone had someone waiting for them. Except me. The hard bench beneath me, which once felt stable, now felt like it was holding me in place, insisting I face this to the end. And I, who always prided myself on being strong, resilient, unshakable, felt, for the first time in a long time, too fragile to sustain the illusion I had created. And maybe that's why I want those listening to write in the comments. I've felt that silence. Because this kind of silence isn't just silence. It's the silence that presses on your chest, the silence that reveals, the silence that exposes. It's the silence that turns hope into a wound. And I know many people have lived that exact moment when the atmosphere changes and everything around you seems to conspire to show that the truth was already there. You just refused to see it. The silence of the afternoon continued deepening, and I felt something inside. Me on the verge of breaking. Not a loud, dramatic break, but an internal one. A kind of emotional surrender. It was as if every part of me that had fought, insisted, believed, was finally understanding that the waiting had a purpose I didn't yet comprehend. And even without understanding, I knew something important was drawing near. A revelation, an awakening, an inevitable change walking in my direction, while I clung to the last crumbs of a hope that no longer made sense. And it was in that exact moment that the afternoon began to darken inside me before the sky ever did. When the afternoon grew dark inside me, before the sky even changed, something finally opened. An old memory, almost forgotten, surfaced as if silence itself had pulled it up by the hand. And that's when, unintentionally, I began to understand who this woman truly was, the one who had left me waiting on that bench. Because her absence didn't hurt only in the present, it hurt across the entire history we carried together. She wasn't a stranger or just an acquaintance. She was someone who took up too much space in my life and at the same time never learned how to truly be present. She was my foster sister, the one who grew up with me, who shared a home, meals, clothes, advice, and secrets. But she always loved in a different way, a crooked, hurried, selfish way that I, in my innocence, mistook for affection. Yet time, that quiet teacher, always showed signs I refused to see. I defended her to the world, even when she never defended me from anyone. I put her at the center of everything, even when she pushed me to the margins of her own story. And that day, sitting in that square, the last piece of this emotional puzzle finally clicked into place. I remembered a distant afternoon from our teenage years when she promised to wait for me at the school gate. She said we'd walk home together. I believed her. I stood there, staring at the gate, imagining our usual conversation on the way back. But she didn't show. When I arrived home, I found her laughing with other people, as if she had never made a promise at all. And me? I smiled, pretending it didn't matter, pretending I hadn't spent nearly an hour wondering if something had happened. That was the first crack, and on that bench, I felt that crack pulse again, as if it had never healed. Another memory opened like an old book, a night when I was living through one of the hardest moments of my life. I needed her presence, her shoulder, her words. She said she'd come. 5 minutes, she'd said. I waited until dawn, my heart shattered, believing she'd knock on the door. But she never did. And when she finally spoke to me days later, she acted like my pain was exaggerated, as if I were always the one asking for too much, when all I ever asked for was the bare minimum: presence. Every memory returning through the force of that silence carried a wound I didn't know was still open. She had always been this way, present when it benefited her, absent when it required reciprocity. And still, I called her family. Still, I defended her from criticism, judgment, accusations that deep down I knew were true. I protected her as if it were my responsibility to hide her flaws from the world. And maybe that's why her absence on that bench hurt so deeply. It wasn't just her physical absence. It was the accumulation of years of it, finally becoming impossible to ignore. And I know many people listening understand this dynamic perfectly. That bond that should be love, but becomes emotional dependence instead. That connection you sustain alone, believing one day the person will change, mature, finally see the value in what you've always offered freely. That's why, if you've ever loved someone who only came back when they needed something, write in the comments, "I've lived this." Such a simple phrase, yet it carries the weight of thousands of stories. People who loved too much and received too little. The most painful part is that even knowing all this, I always found a way to defend her. It's astonishing how creative we become when justifying someone's absence. I told myself she was busy, that she had a complicated life, that she didn't know how to show affection properly. I built entire explanations just to avoid admitting the truth. She didn't choose to be present. She showed up when it was convenient and disappeared when I needed her. But on that bench, in that quiet afternoon, the excuses stopped making sense. A flash of memory hit me so strongly, it made my body tremble. It was the day she said the one sentence I never fully digested. "You're strong. You don't need me." She said it every time she wanted to escape emotional responsibility. And for a long time, I accepted it. I accepted it because I truly believed strength meant carrying everything alone. But sitting on that bench, I realized too much strength also hurts. Because when people see you only as strong, they feel entitled to abandon you, as if you're obligated to handle everything silently. And there, as the sky grew darker, I finally understood the depth of our story. She didn't come back because she never learned how to. Never learned to consider anyone's feelings but her own. Never learned what it meant to care, to take responsibility, to make amends. And every time she said 5 minutes, it was just a polite way of saying, "You can wait, I have other priorities." And I, too, loving or too naive, always accepted it. But that day, on that bench, something essential began to shift inside me. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hatred, it was understanding. A bitter understanding, but a freeing one. The understanding that I had spent my entire life giving her a love she never knew how to return. And that's why her absence hurt so deeply. Because it wasn't about her not coming back that day. It was about her never having truly returned at any point in our story. The silence of the afternoon, once just uncomfortable, now revealed everything. And as I breathed deeply, feeling the weight of those revelations, I realized the waiting wasn't just waiting. It was a reunion with myself. A reunion I didn't ask for, but one that was necessary. The truth I had avoided for so many years was finally there, ready to be faced, while I remained seated on that bench, the exact place where our story had always been destined to break. The sun began to drop as if rushing away, faster than she ever had. The light that once warmed the square now turned into a heavy, almost sorrowful orange, creating a scene that matched exactly what I felt inside. The sun leaving before she did was the first undeniable sign that the waiting had reached its limit. The whole world seemed to be withdrawing, leaving only me, the bench, and the truth approaching slowly but firmly. And when the shadows finally reached my feet, I understood something that pierced straight through my soul. No one runs late when they've already decided not to come back. That sentence didn't come from outside. It rose from within me with the force of something that had always been there, waiting for its moment. Because in that instant, when I realized the sun had already abandoned me, it became impossible to pretend it was just a simple delay. Nature itself was ending the day while I still tried to hold together the fantasy that she'd return. It felt as though everything around me already knew the truth before I did. Even the bench beneath me seemed to carry a silent wisdom, unshaken, as if it had seen countless people living the same story, repeating the same pattern of waiting for someone who never comes back. I set my hands on the bench, feeling the metal grow colder. That's when I noticed something undeniable. That simple object was more present than the person I was waiting for. The bench never promised me anything, yet it fulfilled everything: steady, loyal, unwavering. And somehow, that contrast cut deeply. I had been offering devotion to someone who never promised true presence, while receiving constancy from something that wasn't even alive, had no heart, had no concept of love. That realization hurt in a way I can hardly describe, but it was necessary to reveal the magnitude of what I had been giving. The light continued to dim, and each second of deepening darkness brought a new revelation. Something inside me collapsed, not loudly, but quietly, like the final crack in an illusion that had stood far too long. Layer by layer, the truth emerged, and with it came something else, something beginning to awaken. It was as if, in the same space where the pain settled, a new truth was trying to rise. A truth I had avoided, but one I could no longer deny. I inhaled deeply, feeling the cold air brush my face, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to admit that her absence wasn't an accident. It was a choice, a repeated choice, built across years of behavior, actions, and indifference, that I had constantly shielded with fragile excuses. Acknowledging this was like turning on a light in a room that had been dark for far too long. I didn't like what I saw, but seeing it was necessary. Seeing is always the first step toward healing, even when it hurts. The square began to empty, people leaving, children gathering their toys, couples picking up their bags, elderly folks pulling their jackets closed. Life moved on effortlessly while I remained there, trying to understand at what point I had lost myself on the path of someone who never took even half a step toward me. The voices around me softened until they were just distant noise, and when the last ray of sunlight touched the ground, I felt the day telling me it was time to face the truth exactly as it was, without embellishment, without denial, without fragile hope. And maybe that's why I want whoever is listening to write in the comments, "I waited too long for someone who wouldn't return." This isn't about exposing wounds. It's about recognizing stories so many people carry silently, never putting into words. Because this truth isn't just mine. It runs through families, friendships, relationships, through bonds that should have been homes, but instead became mazes. As the night started touching the sky, I sensed something inside me understanding what was happening perfectly. It wasn't about lateness. It wasn't about the time. It was about the decision she made long before she left me sitting on that bench. She didn't return because she never learned how. Never learned how to care, how to repair, how to look back. And I, in that evening turning into night, finally saw this with a sad but liberating clarity. Every minute without light deepened my understanding. The darkness no longer scared me. It felt like the perfect backdrop for the truth to reveal itself without distractions. It was as if the night had arrived just to show me that I had always been alone in that relationship, even when I believed otherwise. And for the first time, I felt something different move inside me. A strength that had been dormant, a courage I didn't know I still had, a sense that this moment, painful as it was about to transform my life in a way I could never undo. The bench held my body still, but it was the awakening truth that held my soul. The realization that no one disappears by mistake, no one abandons by accident, no one fails to return by coincidence. Absence is a choice. Indifference is a choice. Silence is a choice. And understanding that hurt, but it also carved out space for something I still couldn't name. A space that, even empty, felt more honest than any presence I had forced for years. The night settled slowly, the sky shifting above me, and there I remained on that bench, knowing life was about to hand me a revelation far greater than that simple wait suggested. The world outside had already accepted that the day was over, but inside me, the ending of that emotional chapter was only beginning to take shape, asking to be understood, accepted, lived through completely before I could move on. And as darkness finally replaced the sun, I understood that this was the exact moment when everything would change. When the night finally took the sun's place, I felt there was nothing left on that bench capable of holding me there. My body was tired, but my soul felt even heavier, as if every memory I had revisited had stacked another brick on my chest. Still, I stood, up, and standing up at that moment was more than a physical movement. It felt like a ritual, a symbolic gesture marking the beginning of something I didn't yet fully understand, but somehow already knew needed to happen. The first thing I felt was the cold night air brushing my face, a cold that almost seemed to shake me awake, as if telling me it was time to move forward, even if every step hurt a little. The square that had been full of life earlier was now nearly empty. The streetlights cast long shadows that shifted with every breeze, and each shadow seemed to tell a different story. I started walking slowly, feeling the solid ground beneath my feet, but sensing that the true steadiness was rising from within me. Every step carried a piece of that long wait, that disappointment, that misplaced love. It was as if the walk back home were an inner crossing where I finally faced what I had avoided for years. The night echoed inside me everything I had always tried to silence. The giwai, truth that I had spent a good part of my life waiting for 5 minutes that never arrived. And it wasn't just about her. When I began looking back, I realized my story was filled with people who asked me for 5 minutes. 5 minutes to talk, 5 minutes to pay attention to me, 5 minutes to stand by my side, 5 minutes that became hours of emotional waiting, days of uncertainty, years of disappointment. Abandonment never begins big. It starts like this. With small waits, we convince ourselves our normal, small absences we try to disguise, small excuses we repeat so we don't have to face the truth. And there, as I walked down that nearly empty street, I began to recognize each one of those wounds. The most painful part is that I was always the one who adapted, the one who said, "It's okay," even when nothing was okay, the one who accepted emotional leftovers as if they were a full meal, the one who settled for the bare minimum because I was afraid of losing even that. And in the darkness of that night, I realized the cost of that, how much I had shrunk myself to fit inside the lives of people who never made space for me. As I walked, old memories surfaced, moments when someone promised they'd be with me real quick and left me waiting alone, as if my presence were disposable. And that started awakening a dormant sense of pride inside me, a pride I didn't even know still existed, because there, in that quiet walk, I understood that it wasn't just pain. There was strength too, a strength that had been hiding behind all the times I endured the unbearable, stayed when I should have left, offered love when I should have offered boundaries. That strength began rising like a timid but steady flame. I felt it grow with every step, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel weak for being hurt. I felt human. I felt alive. I felt aware of what I truly deserved. The street was silent, but inside me there was a storm. Not a storm of despair like before, but a storm of awakening. Every part of the road seemed to speak to me. The shadow of a tree reminded me of the times I hid behind excuses I invented for other people. The distant glow of a lit window reminded me of all the nights I stayed awake, waiting for calls that never came. The uneven sidewalk reminded me of the twisted paths I walked, trying to fix relationships that had been broken long before I ever arrived. And the more I walked, the more I realized that this journey back home was actually a journey back to myself. I understood in that moment that the wound wasn't just absence. The wound was also a warning. It was my heart saying I couldn't keep living in a state of endless waiting. It was my soul begging to be cared for by me, since the people I had waited for all my life never knew how to care for me. And the more that awareness grew, the more I understood that the pride I felt wasn't arrogance. It was self-worth trying to be reborn, a self-worth that had been asleep for so long that I nearly forgot it existed. And that's why I wanted to ask those listening to write in the comments. I won't wait anymore, not as a complaint, but as a declaration, a stance, a mark of the emotional turning point so many people need to claim for themselves. Because this story, this walk, this wound, none of it belongs only to me. It belongs to everyone who has waited too long, carried too much, trusted too deeply in people who gave too little. This walk symbolizes something profound, The exact moment when pain becomes awareness, and awareness, once it arrives, prepares the soul for liberation. With every step I took, the park bench grew more distant, and with it went the illusions I had clung to for years. The night lit the street with a soft glow, and I began to sense that the darkness wasn't a threat. It was a passage. The darkness in that moment felt like the womb of something being born inside me, something tied to dignity, strength, and the decision to never again place myself where I had to beg for attention. I had spent years accepting less than I deserved, and it was only when the sun left me alone on that bench that I understood just how long I had been abandoning myself long before that moment. And still, even with all that clarity, there was a sting in my chest, a leftover pain reminding me that freedom never comes without tearing something inside. The walk is never only physical, it's emotional. Each step felt like it was pulling away a piece of everything that no longer served me, as if I were leaving along that street all the expectations that had kept me trapped. And I knew, as I walked, that the journey wouldn't end when I reached my door. There was still more to understand, more to face, more to reveal. But in that moment, in that quiet night, one thing was already certain. I was no longer the woman who sat on that bench waiting for 5 minutes that never came. I was changing, and that change, even painful, was beginning to make space for something I still needed to discover. I kept walking, and the night seemed to walk beside me, as if it wanted to show me something I'd never had the courage to see. The air was cold, but there was a kind of warmth growing inside me that didn't come from my body or my steps, but from the awareness slowly unfolding as I revisited my own story. It was as if the night had prepared a quiet space for me to understand the true meaning of that wait, and of so many others before it. And in that deep, almost sacred silence, I began to realize that life had tried to teach me the same lesson many times, but only now was I ready to hear it. I had always expected too much from those who gave so little, always gave more than I received, always offered presents to people who offered me absence. And that didn't happen because I was weak, needy, or naive. It happened because I had a heart that believed people could change, believed love could teach, believed loyalty could spark reciprocity. But that night, as my steps echoed on the empty sidewalk, I realized that self-love is also faith. Faith in your own dignity, faith in your own worth, faith in the truth that God never asks you to remain where your soul is being suffocated. The truth is, waiting hurts differently when you finally understand it was never about time, but about deserving. And that night I realized that my heart had always known how to measure other people's investment, even when my mind kept justifying the unjustifiable. I closed my eyes to avoid seeing the obvious, but life always finds a way to show it, and it was showing me right there in that quiet street that waiting for someone who chooses not to return is like trying to hold water in your hands. The more you try to grasp it, the faster it slips away. The more you insist, the more it hurts. I began remembering every time I accepted less than I deserved, every moment I shrank myself to fit inside someone's limited heart, every time I was too patient, too understanding, too loving. And the saddest part is that even when I was all that, it was still never enough for someone who didn't know how to love. And it was in that point of the night that a deep thought passed through me. Sometimes waiting isn't a sign of love. It's a sign of lacking boundaries. It's the heart begging you to look at yourself with more kindness, more respect, more truth. I took a deep breath, feeling the night fill my lungs, like a reminder that I was still alive. And being alive means you still have the chance to learn. Sometimes life teaches through whispers, sometimes through storms. That day, it chose to teach me through silence, a silence that screamed, a silence that revealed everything I had tried to hide. And the more I accepted that revelation, the more I understood that the waiting had not been a waste of time. It had been preparation for an emotional awakening I had postponed for years, preparation to see that loving someone else cannot mean abandoning yourself, preparation to understand that God never closes a door without giving you the courage to walk toward the exit. Night is a cruel mirror for those who carry wounds. It amplifies what daylight disguises, and as I walked, I felt each step stirring memories I had kept for love, for fear, or simply out of habit. Some steps were heavy, loaded with pain. Others were lighter, filled with release. I shifted between the two rhythms like someone learning to walk. Again, after a fall. And slowly, I realized that this walk was also a ritual of letting go. Not of the person who left, but of the version of myself who believed she had to sacrifice everything to deserve love. And that is why I want you to write in the comments, "I choose my worth." This simple yet powerful statement transforms the heart of whoever writes it, because the truth is that much of our pain begins the moment we forget our own worth, when we accept emotional crumbs as if they were a feast, when we ignore clear signs of indifference because we prefer to believe in empty promises. But life, in its quietest moments, insists on reminding us that waiting too long for someone who gives too little slowly pulls us away from ourselves. And returning to yourself is one of the most sacred acts of self-love. I kept walking, and with every street I crossed, something inside me seemed to reorganize, as if the walk were realigning my thoughts, my wounds, my limits. The night, once heavy, now felt comforting, as if it wrapped me in a spiritual blanket, reminding me I wasn't alone, and I truly wasn't, because the awareness of your own worth is powerful company. Wisdom is powerful company. God, especially, is powerful company. And with these quiet presences walking beside me, I began to understand that the waiting had served to open my eyes, not to break my heart. The real meaning of waiting isn't in the time that passes, but in what that time reveals. And for me, that night revealed that I couldn't keep pouring my love into dry soil, expecting something to bloom where no roots ever existed. The waiting showed me that I was investing in someone who never planted anything in return. It showed that my love ran deeper than someone who only knew how to skim the surface. It showed that my heart was far too vast to fit into such small hands, and admitting that felt like a weight slowly lifting off my chest, but lifting. The wisdom of that night didn't arrive with shouting. It didn't arrive with anger. It didn't arrive with rebellion. It arrived with a serenity I didn't expect, as if the universe whispered, "Now you've seen. Now you know. Now you can choose differently." And that possibility of choosing began to grow inside me like a new seed, a seed planted in pain but already carrying the promise of flowers. I kept walking, and the emptiness that once consumed me slowly gave way to something deeper, the understanding that self-love is also a path, a faith, a healing. And I knew, as I walked through the darkness, that the lesson wasn't finished. The night still had more to reveal. I still needed to understand something greater about everything that had happened, because the waiting, painful as it was, had not been useless. It had been guiding me toward a deeper understanding of what it truly means to love, to trust, to stay. And inside me, I felt another revelation approaching, waiting only for the next step of that spiritual journey life had chosen. For me, on that quiet night, night had already taken over everything around me when I stopped in front of my door, feeling that something inside me was no longer the same. The wind blew softly, as if trying to carry away everything that no longer belonged to me. And at that moment, before walking inside, I turned back and looked at the path I had just walked, not to look for anyone, not to feed old expectations, but to recognize how much that walk had changed the woman now standing there with a different presence. The journey had been long, quiet, filled with memories I would rather not revisit, but also full of revelations that, despite the pain, opened a space inside me that I thought would never open again. I realized the bench where everything began wasn't a prison, as I had thought so many times. It was a mirror that didn't show my appearance, but my inner self. It reflected every moment when I gave more than I had, every instant when I carried the emotional weight of bonds held up only by my hands. It reflected how accustomed I had become to waiting without receiving, sustaining without reciprocity, keeping alive a flame the other person never even tried to light. And in that silent mirror, I saw myself in a way I had never seen before, whole, even when wounded, strong, even when tired, deep, even when broken. It was that night that I learned one of the hardest, yet most liberating truths. Some absences are answers. Answers that need no explanation, no justification, no speech. Answers that teach more than any forced presence ever could. Answers that close cycles quietly, yet precisely. Her absence taught me to look at myself with honesty, to recognize that the love I offered was far too great to be wasted in hands far too small. And in accepting that, something inside me aligned, as if my soul finally understood that releasing what doesn't nourish is never a loss. The weight of that waiting transformed. It didn't disappear, because some pains leave marks to remind us who we are, but it found new places inside me. The hurt found a place, the pride found a voice, and awareness found room to grow. The night, in all its depth, wrapped me like a blanket of healing, and walking through it finally gave me the clarity I had been missing. The clarity that you cannot move forward without closing the right door. The clarity that you cannot harvest flowers where the other person never planted. The clarity that self-love is not an occasional feeling. It is a daily commitment to your own soul. And that's why, before I end, I want you to write in the comments a phrase that carries the essence of everything we lived here. I recognize my worth. Write it as a commitment, as a reminder, as an intimate manifesto, a silent promise between you and your own story. Because recognizing your worth is the first step in breaking any cycle of emotional abandonment people once convinced you was normal. It isn't. It never was. And it's time to reclaim your strength. Life has mysterious ways of teaching us. Sometimes it uses joy, sometimes laughter, but often it uses pain, not to punish, but to open us, so truth can enter, so real love can find space to grow. The night of that waiting taught me that self-love is never begged for. It is built. That respect isn't demanded. It is established. That reciprocity isn't requested. It is observed. And above all, healing begins when we finally stop chasing after those who never learned how to walk beside us. And now that this story has found a place inside you, I want to tell you something important. There is much more wisdom waiting for you. There are other stories, other reflections, other truths that, just like this one, have the power to touch quiet wounds and awaken strengths you didn't know you still carried. The matriarch's journey doesn't end here. It continues on many different paths, each with its own light, each with its own lesson, each carrying a piece of what transforms. The next video on your screen brings another story, a different story, but with the same soul of healing, the same emotional force, the same search for depth, understanding, and truth. A new voice, a new scene, a new moment for you to see yourself from a different angle. And just as this story touched something deep inside you, that one may open another door, illuminate another corner of your soul, reveal another answer you may have been searching for. So go. Tap on the next video. Allow yourself to continue this journey of wisdom that isn't a continuation of this same story, but a continuation of the same truth. The truth that every woman carries ancestral strength, a resilient heart, a scar that speaks, and a destiny that never depends on anyone who didn't know how to stay. There is more for you to learn, more to feel, more to awaken. And every video, every word, every reflection is a reminder that your story deserves to be honored with depth, awareness, and grace. The night of that waiting taught me who I am. The next video may teach you something important too. The story changes, but the essence remains. Healing continues, the voice continues, the wisdom continues, and you deserve to hear every part of it. Go to the next video. The journey toward your own truth is waiting for you there.